Hello, my name is Reem, and today I will be diving into the study of families through the lens of history. Throughout this presentation, we will explore the evolution of family structures across various time periods and eras. Over the years, there has been a significant evolution in the structure and dynamics of families across various time periods. From prehistoric times to the 21st century, families have experienced notable changes influenced by factors such as societal norms, economic shifts, technological advancements, and cultural transformations. These shifts have led to change in family size, roles within family, living arrangements, and the overall definition of what constitutes a family unit. The evolution of families reflect the broader changes in societies and highlight the adaptability of family structures to changing environments and contexts throughout history. The first era, prehistoric times. Prehistoric times refer to the period in human history before the invention of writing and recorded history. This period spans from 8000 to 3000 BCE, which is 8000 to 3000 years before the Common Era or before Christ existed. How were families during this era? Families during this era were very different from how families are today in the 21st century. They had very different lifestyles and distinct habits from the people today. Let's start with nomadic lifestyle. During this era, many families led a nomadic lifestyle, constantly on the move in search of food, water, and shelter. Unlike our modern world, these basic necessities were not readily accessible, highlighting the challenges they faced. Small family units. Families back then typically consisted of small, close-knit groups, which were often blood-related. Extended family. Extended family including grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins often lived together or nearby, forming larger clan groups. Gender roles. Men's roles typically consisted of hunting and protecting the family, while women's roles consisted of gathering plant-based food, cooking, and taking care of the children. Shelter. Housing during this era varied from simple temporary shelters like tents made of animal skins to more permanent structures such as huts made from wood, mud, and thatch. Clothing. Clothing was generally composed of animal skins, fur, and plant materials designed to suit their climate and environment. Tools and weapons. Families back then used simpler tools and weapons made of stone, bone, and wood to help them in their daily tasks and protection. Social structure. Families were generally part of larger tribal groups with a defined social structure and roles within the community. Early religion and rituals. Some families back then believed in the idea of religion and engaged in early forms of religious practices and rituals which were often tied to nature and ancestor worship. Finally, communal living. Cooperation within the family and larger group was essential to people of this era to ensure survival. This cooperation among each other encouraged shared responsibilities and resources. The second era, ancient civilizations. The ancient civilization period in human history spans from 3000 years before the Common Era to 500 years in the current era. How were families during this era? Families during this era were different among the world in countries like Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient China, ancient India, and ancient Mesoamerica. Let's take a look at the families during this era in each country individually. Let's start with the ancient civilization era in Mesopotamia. The Mesopotamians during this era followed a patriarchal society, meaning families were typically headed by their eldest male. Similar to the prehistoric times, they also had extended families with multiple generations, often living together under one roof. In terms of legal contracts, marriage and family relations were governed by legal contracts including dowries and prenuptial agreements. What were the roles of the Mesopotamian children during this era? Sons were preferred for inheritance and continuing family lines, while daughters were often married off to strengthen alliances. Moving on, let's talk about the ancient civilization era in ancient Egypt. Egyptians during this era had nuclear families, meaning the core family unit was the husband, wife, and children, though extended family ties were sometimes significant. In terms of matrilineal influence, women had relatively high status and could own property, initiate divorce, and engage in business. Childhood. High value was placed on children as they were often depicted in ancient Egyptian art and literature as important family members. As for ancestor worship, families maintained strong connections with deceased relatives by wrapping the bodies with long strips of linen before burying them and engaging in rituals and offerings. Ancient civilization era in ancient Greece. Similar to the Mesopotamians, the Greeks during this era also followed a patriarchal structure, meaning the father held legal and economic authority over the household. Oikos. The family unit, including extended kin and slaves, formed the fundamental social, financial, and economic structure. How were marriage practices in ancient Greece during this era? Marriages were often arranged to secure social and economic alliances. As for the role of women were generally confined to domestic roles but could not influence household affairs. The ancient civilization time period in ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, they followed a paterfamilias structure, which means that the oldest male, known as the paterfamilias, had absolute authority over all the family members. Extended families. This included not just nuclear family members, but also slaves and clients. How was marriage and adoption in ancient Rome? Both were important for securing political alliances and inheritance. As for adoption was a common practice for ensuring male heir. Education and socialization. Boys were prepared for public life citizenship, while girls were groomed and managing households and child rearing. Moving on to the ancient civilization time period in ancient China. The Chinese are known for having that beautiful tradition and culture, which was visible even back in the day during the ancient civilization times, through Confucian influence. This emphasized filial piety, respect for elders, and ancestral worship. Extended family households. This often included multiple generations living together. The Chinese also followed the patriarchal norms, which means that the male head of the family wielded significant power, although the women back in the days could also wield influence within their home. Marriage alliances. Marriages were arranged to strengthen family ties and social standing. Now moving on to the next country, ancient India, during the ancient civilization time period. Ancient India followed joint family systems, which means that multiple generations lived together, sharing resources and responsibilities. They also had the patriarchal authority, which means that the eldest male member held authority over family members. Marriage customs. Arranged marriages were prevalent, with dowries and castle considerations playing a crucial role. Dharma and duty. Family roles and relationships were deeply influenced by religious and cultural duties known as dharma. And finally, ancient civilization time period in ancient Mesoamerica. Before we dive into the families in ancient Mesoamerica, what is Mesoamerica? The historic region of Mesoamerica comprises of the modern-day countries of northern Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Belize, and central to southern Mexico. So how were families in ancient Mesoamerica? Families had extended family units, which included parents, children, grandparents, and other relatives. They had communal living, which means that families often lived in large communal compounds. What was the role of women? Women were involved in household management, weaving, and sometimes trade. And finally, for children's education, children were educated in their cultural and religious practices, with boys often receiving more formal education. Moving on to the next era, the medieval period. The medieval period spans from 500 years to 1,500 years into the Common Era. How were families during this period? Families followed the patriarchal structure, meaning that families were typically patriarchal with the father or the eldest male as the head. Extended families. Households often included extended family members such as grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. What were the gender roles like? Men were usually responsible for working and providing for the family, while women managed the household and cared for children. Children's roles. Children were expected to contribute to household chores from a young age and were often apprenticed or sent to work early. Arranged marriages. Marriages were often arranged for economic, political, or social advantages rather than for love. Dowries and bride prices. The exchange of dowries provided by the bride's family and bride prices paid by the groom's family were common practices back in the medieval period. Marriage age. Women typically married in their teens while men married in their 20s. The rural versus the urban life. Most families lived in rural areas and were involved in agriculture, while urban families engaged in trade and crafts. Self-sufficiency. Families were largely self-sufficient, producing their own food, clothing, and other necessities. Education. Education was limited back then, often provided by the church, and mainly available to boys. Noble families might hire tutors. Peasant families. The majority of the population were peasants, living under feudal obligations to a lord and working the land. Noble families. Noble families had more wealth and power, often living in castles or large manors, with many servants and a focus on managing estates. Artisan and merchant families. In towns, artisan and merchant families formed a growing middle class, contributing to the economy through trade and craftsmanship. Moving on to the fourth time period on our list, the early modern period, which spans from years 1500 to 1700 years into the Common Era. Families during this era also followed the patriarchal structure, meaning that families were typically patriarchal, with the father or the eldest male holding authority over household and making important decisions. Extended families. Extended families often lived together or in close proximity, including grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, contributing to a sense of community and support. The role of women. Women's roles were largely domestic, focusing on managing the household, raising children, and sometimes assisting with agriculture or craft-based work. The importance of marriage in the early modern period. Marriage was central to social and economic stability, often arranged for reasons of wealth, social status, or political alliances rather than solely for romantic love. Children. Families tended to be larger due to high infant mortality rates and the need for labor in agriculture societies. Children were expected to contribute to household tasks from a young age. Religious influence. Religious beliefs and practices played a significant role in family life, shaping moral values, education, and daily routines. Education. Education was often limited in the early modern period, with basic literacy and numeracy skills taught within the family, especially to boys, while girls received minimal formal education, focusing instead on household duties. Social hierarchy. Family structures reflected wider social hierarchies, with nobility and aristocracy enjoying privileges and wealth, while peasants and laborers struggled with poverty and insecurity. The Industrial Revolution time period. The Industrial Revolution time period spans from 1,700 years to 1,850 years into the Common Era. How were families during this era? Economic transformation. Families underwent significant changes as the Industrial Revolution shifted economies from agrarian to industrial. Many moved from rural areas to cities in search of employment, opportunities, and factors. Family structure. The extended family, typically in agriculture societies, began to give way to nuclear families as individuals sought work in urban centers. The shift was partly due to the need for mobility and concentration of job opportunities in industrial areas. Child labor. Children as young as 5 or 6 were often employed in factories or mines, contributing to family income. This led to altered family dynamics, as children spent long hours working rather than being primarily involved in education or domestic tasks. Gender roles. Traditional gender roles persisted, but the demands of industrial labor sometimes required women and children to work outside the home alongside men. This challenged traditional family roles and led to debates about the appropriate roles for women and children in society. Housing condition. Families often lived in cramped, unsanitary conditions in urban slums near factories. This environment had detrimental effects on health and family life, leading to high mortality rates and strained family relationships. Social dislocation. The rapid pace of industrial disrupted traditional social structures and community ties, leading to social dislocation for many families. This could result in increased isolation and vulnerability, particularly for those who migrated to industrial centers seeking work. Education. While access to education increased in some areas during the Industrial Revolution, particularly in urban centers, many children from working-class families received minimal education or were entirely deprived of it due to the need to work. Poverty and social inequality. Industrialization led to widening gaps between rich and poor, with many families living in poverty while a wealthy industrial elite emerged. This inequality had profound effects on family life, exacerbating social tensions and contributing to social unrest. Moving on to the sixth time period, the 20th century. The 20th century era spans from 1,900 years to 2,000 years into the Common Era. Traditional nuclear families. The nuclear family, consisting of a husband, wife, and their children living together in one household, was the predominant family structure, especially in the early to mid-20th century. Gender roles. Gender roles were often more rigidly defined, with men typically serving as breadwinners and women primarily responsible for domestic duties and childcare. However, these roles began to shift over the course of the century, particularly with women's increasing participation in the workforce during times like World War II. Extended families. Extended families, including grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, often lived in close proximity or within the same household, providing a strong support network and often sharing resources. Economic challenges. Families faced various economic challenges throughout the century, including the Great Depression in the 1930s and periods of recession. Economic hardship sometimes necessitated multiple family members working to make ends meet. Technological advancements. The 20th century saw significant technological advancements that impacted family life, such as the introduction of household appliances like washing machines and refrigerators, which reduced the time required for domestic chores and improved living standards. Changing family dynamics. Social and cultural shifts, including the women's liberation movement and changing attitudes toward marriage and divorce, led to evolving family dynamics. Divorce rates rose during the latter half of the century, leading to an increase in single-parent households. Education and child rearing. Education became increasingly important for children, with more emphasis placed on formal schooling and academic achievement. Parent styles evolved, with a greater focus on child development and psychology. Media and entertainment. The rise of mass media, including radio, television, and later the internet, influenced family life by shaping cultural norms, values, and entertainment preferences. Families often gathered around radios and later TVs for shared entertainment experiences. Migration and urbanization. Urbanization and migration patterns shifted throughout the century, with many families relocating from rural areas to cities in search of economic opportunities. This sometimes led to changes in family structure and support networks. Healthcare and well-being. Advances in healthcare and sanitation led to improved health outcomes for families, including lower infant mortality rates and increased life expectancy. However, access to healthcare and disparities in healthcare outcomes remained issues for many families, especially those in marginalized communities. And finally, the 21st century. We are currently living in the 21st century as it spans from the years 2000 to our present day. How are families living in our current present day in the 21st century? Digital connectivity. Families became increasingly connected digitally with the widespread adoption of smartphones, social media, and video calling platforms, facilitating communication and interaction even across great distances. Changing structures. The traditional nuclear family model evolved, with the rise of single-parent households, blended families, and same-sex parent families becoming more common and socially accepted. Diverse family structures. An increased recognition and acceptance of LGBTQ families, including same-sex couples, raising children, and LGBTQ individuals forming families through adoption, surrogacy, and assisted reproductive technologies, making a significant shift towards inclusivity and diversity in family structures. Education emphasis. There was an increasing emphasis on education within families, with parents often highly invested in their children's academic success and seeking to provide them with the best possible opportunities for advancement. Diverse cultural influences. Globalization led to greater exposure to diverse cultural influences within families, whether through international travel, migration, or media consumption, contributing to more culturally diverse family dynamics. Delayed marriage and parenthood. There was a trend towards delayed marriage and parenthood as individuals pursued higher education, established careers, and prioritized personal goals before starting families. Health and wellness focus. Families increasingly prioritized health and wellness, with a growing emphasis on physical fitness, mental health awareness, and nutrition as integral components of family life. Evolving gender roles. Gender roles within families continue to evolve, with greater gender equality in household responsibilities and caregiving roles, as well as a shift towards more flexible and non-traditional gender roles overall. Economic pressures. Economic pressures, including rising living costs, stagnant wages, and economic instability, sometimes placed strains on families, leading to financial stress and uncertainty about the future. Technology impact. Technology played a significant role in shaping family dynamics, from changing how families communicate and spend time together to influencing parenting styles and children's development, raising concerns about screen time and digital addiction. In conclusion, from ancient tribes to today's digital world, Families have changed a lot over time. In ancient times and the Middle Ages, they were different from what we know now. Then came the Industrial Revolution and the 20th century, which shook things up even more. Now, in the 21st century, families connect in new ways online. Even though families have changed, they've always stayed important. They show how people can adapt and grow no matter what changes can happen around them. If you made it this far to my presentation, thank you so much for listening, and that is the history of families throughout the different time periods.